In the South, political, social, and economic concerns were far different from those in the North. The warmer climate provided the South with a long growing season, and the region naturally embraced agriculture. Although the South had some industries, mostly farm-related, and cities, it remained essentially rural. Cherished symbols of the Old South were the homes on the great plantations. Plantations on which large numbers of black slaves toiled for their masters. Actually, the great majority of Southern whites lived in far more modest surroundings. Only a small percentage owned slaves. And most who did own slaves possessed just a few, sometimes only one or two. In 1860, when slavery in the South was at its peak, fewer than 3,000 whites owned as many as 100 slaves. In all the South, only 11 people possessed more than 500 slaves. Yet, in a sense, these wealthy, educated planters ruled the region.
All that I see is owned by me, the houses, slaves, and land, and we who were meant to be the aristocracy must guide with a firm but fatherly hand.
From colonial times, wealthy Southerners were considered to be part of an aristocracy which produced many of the nation's first presidents. A minority whose gracious way of life came to symbolize the Southern ideal. And basic to that way of life was black slavery. Before America's independence from Britain, slavery existed in all the American colonies, but later proved unprofitable in the North. By the 1800s, slavery had become concentrated in the South, where plantation farming required many hands. White Southerners who grew up with blacks as part of their households seldom thought to question the owning of slaves. But slaves were seen by some white Southerners as human beings like themselves. They felt it was wrong for one human being to own another. Indeed, back in the late 1700s, Southerners had led the movements for emancipation. But the invention in 1793 of the cotton gin, a simple machine which made possible for the first time the large-scale production of cotton, ended all thoughts of freeing the slaves. Cotton production soared, up from 5 million pounds in 1793 to more than 22 billion by 1860.
Jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton.
Reliance on slave labor grew accordingly.
Jump down, turn around, pick a bale a day.
As Southern prosperity became so dependent on cotton, Southerners found it increasingly difficult to suggest abolishing slavery. Slaves represented a substantial capital investment. By 1860, a single farmhand might have cost his master as much as $1,000. Actually, the South still had the economy of a colony. With few factories, the South exported its raw materials, even for processing, and had to import almost all of its manufactured goods. Enterprising northern shipping, banking, and industrial interests grew rich from handling the South's raw materials. More than half of the exports from the port of New York were Southern products.
Northern vultures will open their sanctified jaws and cant of our slave-growing sin. They'll pocket the profits while preaching the law and manage our cotton to spin.
Southerners not only felt exploited by the North, but still felt resentment over tariffs imposed by Congress in 1832 at the insistence of Northern manufacturers. The tariffs were a painful burden, sharply raising the cost of imported products on which the South depended. John Calhoun, prominent Southern spokesman, deplored what he called the tyranny of the majority that had produced the tariffs. Calhoun insisted that when laws helpful to one group were ruinous to another, simple majority rule was unjust. This view prompted most Southerners to look to their own state governments for help. They believed in the states' rights concept, that since the states formed the Union, the actions of each state took precedence over the actions of the federal government.
We states' rights men will not bow down, by federal laws will not be bound. We demand that Washington leave us alone. If they mind their business, we'll mind our own.
Calhoun further contended that a state could even nullify a federal law that was harmful to its interests. In 1832, South Carolina had done just that. It stood by its arms and declared the tariffs imposed by Congress null and void, threatening secession from the Union if any attempt was made to enforce them. Swift action by President Andrew Jackson forced South Carolina to rescind its nullification law. Although tariff reform was promised, the South's feeling of political powerlessness was intensified. During the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the bustling commercial North grew rapidly, with immigrants continually swelling its numbers. By 1860, the North would reach a population of 20 million, compared with only 5.5 million free people in the South. Much of this northern population was surging westward. Western territories, soon to enter the Union as free states, were certain to upset the political balance in Congress. The South felt threatened. To them, it seemed only a matter of time before the North would have complete control of the federal government. The South wanted to assure that its own representation in the Senate was at least equal to that of the North, and encouraged Southerners to move west.
Soils wore out, the cotton's small. Think I'll move out west. My slaves and I will till the soil the way that we know best.
But under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, slavery was permitted only in those territories south of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. After Arkansas became a state in 1836, the only area left for southern expansion was Texas, which only that year had won its independence from Mexico. Southerners urged the admission of Texas into the Union as a state and enthusiastically supported the Mexican War. Southerners were relieved when the Senate failed to pass the Wilmot Proviso, which would have prohibited slavery in any territory gained from Mexico. Slavery was becoming a sensitive national issue. The emergence in the North of the abolitionists, who flooded the South with anti-slavery literature urging blacks to rise in revolt, horrified almost all white Southerners.
Rise up, brothers, the sword unsheathed. Slavery is a hard foe to battle, I believe.
Slave insurrection was sufficiently widespread to arouse great fear among Southern whites, especially after the successful uprising organized by Nat Turner in Virginia.
The slaves cry unheeded, their anguish is spurned, but a lesson of vengeance may soon be learned.
Even after Turner and many of his followers were captured and executed, Southerners remained terrified of the possibility of more slave revolts. Slave owners and non-slave owners were united in this fear. Southerners were indignant when abolitionist writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had no first-hand knowledge of slavery, depicted slave owners as totally evil. They became increasingly sensitive to any criticism of slavery, even among their own people. Throughout the South, post offices were raided and mail from abolitionists destroyed. Citizens were jailed or publicly whipped for criticizing the treatment of slaves.
King Cotton is a monarch who'll conquer abolition, so let's not hear of compromise and nothing of submission.
Southerners began to defend slavery, maintaining that it was sanctioned by God and that blacks were inferior beings who required their care and guidance. Whites insisted that their slaves were happy and that they were far better off than the wage slaves of the cruel northern factories. Their argument that slavery was benevolent gained general acceptance in the South. And many Southerners felt that the extension of slavery into the territories was just and warranted. This extension was facilitated by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opened the Midwest to slavery, providing the settlers approved. Since the South saw its survival as dependent on westward expansion, a great race began between northern and southern settlers for the possession of those territories. Clashes quickly followed. Mistreatment of southern settlers by northerners in Kansas inflamed the southern people, especially after raids such as those conducted by the fiery abolitionist, John Brown, in which southern settlers in Kansas were murdered. Southerners associated these tragic occurrences with the new Republican Party and its prominent candidates. Born out of opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party firmly opposed any extension of slavery into the territories. Southerners saw the possibility of Republican power as a threat, comparable to letting a ferocious cat out of a bag. The Southern way of life, with all its agrarian charms, seemed to be in danger. Southerners wanted to preserve what they had.
I'm glad to be in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie.
We are not the aggressors, insisted Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. When have we ever sought to deprive the North of any advantage? We are on the defensive. How far are you to push us? Davis accepted the idea of secession from the Union only as a last resort. But Southerners like William Yancey and Robert Rhett, known as fire eaters, had been urging secession for years. Their position was greatly strengthened. When John Brown, who had clashed with Southern settlers in Kansas, invaded Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to provoke a massive slave uprising.
Brown conquered Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true, and frightened all the South till she trembled through and through.
The fear of slave insurrection incited by the North spread panic throughout the South.
I'm gonna take my freedom before I die and wear these chains no more.
Increasing numbers of Southerners began to talk of secession. Many became deaf to other points of view. They were convinced that they and their families could be safe only under a new government. At the Democratic National Convention in the spring of 1860, Southerners insisted that a slave code be inserted into the platform. When they did not prevail, they left the party and chose their own candidate for president, John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge's opponents were Abraham Lincoln, who stood on a platform opposing any extension of slavery, Democrat Stephen Douglas, and the border states candidate John Bell.
Honest Abe, you're only a babe to dream of the presidential chair. And Douglas and Bell can both go to hell. Only Breckinridge is fit to sit there.
South Carolina's delegates met in Charleston 1 month after Lincoln's victory, and amid great cheering, unanimously passed an ordinance of secession.
First gallant South Carolina nobly made the stand. Soon Alabama and Louisiana took her by the hand. Mississippi, Florida, Georgia and Texas too, all raised the rebel stars and bars, tearing Lincoln's land in two.
Representatives from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as President of the Confederate States. He urged the North to allow the South to separate peaceably. If you will not have it thus, he warned, if in the pride of power you say we shall not go, but shall remain as subjects to you, then, gentlemen of the North, a war is to be started the like of which men have not seen.